Happy. All right, Sarah, by my clock, I have 11:15. Are you ready to get started?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, for everybody online, we're going to go ahead and get started. I just wanted to thank you very much for being a part of today's very first virtual Marine Science Day. My name is Cinnamon Moffett. I'm the Research Program Manager at Oregon State University's Hatfield Marine Science Center, and I am your host for today's Main Stage Talks. This is a webinar format, which means you do not have control over your mics or cameras or screen shares, but we do hope that you ask us lots and lots of questions using the chat function of Zoom. And you can find that either on the bottom or the top of your screen by clicking the little chat pop-out box. You'll get a place where you can type in questions. Feel free to do that at any time. Most likely we'll get to them at the very end, but we will spend some time with some questions. I also wanted to let folks know we are recording today's main stage talks, and they'll be posted on the Marine Science Day webpage in a couple of days. So if you missed something or want to go back, you're welcome to do that. I also just wanted to remind folks that we are doing talks on the main stage at this exact link all day long until 2. So our next talk will be with Bob Ziak, who will be talking to us about looking for a tsunami in a forest. And that will start at 12:15. So after today, we get done with Sara, you can take a little break, go wander around the virtual world, but then come back and join us at 12:15. If you need to see more information about our upcoming speakers today on the main stage, you just go back to the main stage page where you found this link, and all of the information about our other speakers are there. But why you are here right now is to listen to Sara. So Sara is going to be talking to us a little bit about the conservation outlook for sunflower sea stars. And before we get started with her talk, I just wanted to give you a little background about Sara. Sara did her undergraduate degree in gender studies at Bowdoin College in Maine, which is where I did my master's degree. So I'm familiar and happy to see somebody else who spent some time on the East Coast. Sara is currently a PhD student and an NSF-GRFP fellow at Oregon State University. For her PhD thesis, she takes an applied and interdisciplinary approach to studying bull kelp forests in the Pacific Northwest and creating science that looks at many parts of the kelp forest system, which includes population dynamics of bull kelp here in Oregon and the diets of the purple urchin and best practices for kelp forest conservation. She is passionate about coastal management and policy and works with partners such as the Nature Conservancy, the Oregon Kelp Alliance to support kelp forest monitoring, science, and decision-making. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Sara. Sara, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Cinnamon. Thanks for all your hard work in setting this up today. I'm sure it was not simple, and I really appreciate your efforts. Before I get started, I want to just briefly acknowledge that Oregon State University, where I'm currently located, is located within the traditional homelands of the Ampenifu Band of Kalapuya peoples. Following the Kalapuya Treaty of 1855, Kalapuya peoples were forcibly removed to reservations in Western Oregon, and today the living descendants of these peoples are part of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. Hi, everyone. My name is Sara Hamilton, and I am a PhD student at Oregon State University. And I'm here today to talk about the status and conservation of the sunflower sea star. I want to note that today I'm speaking on behalf of the Pycnopodia recovery team, which is a large group of folks that have been working together to combine data on the sunflower star so that we can all better understand how their populations are doing and explore options for conservation. So I just want to point out that this presentation is a product of a large multinational team effort that I am just one small piece of. So now, without further ado, let's get started. So if everyone could humor me for just a moment, please close your eyes and think of the word conservation. What comes to mind? Okay. You can open your eyes now. Thank you for humoring me. Now, if I had to guess, I would guess that for many of you, critters like pandas, elephants, or tigers came to mind. These are big, beautiful, intelligent mammals, often known as charismatic megafauna. These are often what people think of when they think of conservation. And I want to ask, How often do you think of slimy, creepy crawly invertebrates inching along the ocean floor when you think of conservation? Probably not often is my guess, but I think that you should. Invertebrates, which are just animals that don't have a backbone, like insects, worms, crabs, and sea stars, they actually make up more than 95% of the world's animal species. They often play critical roles in our ecosystems and cultures, and are often understudied compared to vertebrates. Now, the sunflower sea star is a good example of some of these points, and I think that the case of the sunflower star has a lot to teach us about conservation. So keep this in mind because I'm going to circle back to this slide and some of these themes at the end of today's presentation. So as a quick overview of what we'll be talking about, we're going to start by introducing you to the sunflower star. We're going to talk about their connection with kelp forests. I'm going to go over what happened to them, where they are now, what our conservation options for the sunflower star are, and what does this mean for Oregon. And just as a quick note, I'm going to be using the common name for this critter, sunflower star. However, I'm really used to using the species scientific name, which is Pycnopodia. So if you hear me using the term Pycnopodia, I apologize. It means sunflower star, and it just rolls really easily off my tongue at this point. So I hope that's not too confusing. So let's go ahead and meet the sunflower sea star, a literal sea monster. Now, why do I call them a sea monster? I'm not trying to be mean, and to be honest, I think they're incredibly charismatic, beautiful little creatures. But my parents had heard me talking a lot about the sea star as I started working on it. And I think they were envisioning something that was small and cute and brightly colored and maybe had 5 arms. And when I showed them a picture of the sunflower star, like this one on the bottom left over here, they honestly were horrified. Their faces just dropped. And they said that it looked like something out of a sea monster movie, like a kraken. And so I know to a lot of people, it almost has a sea monster vibe. So a few fast facts about this marvelous sea monster. The sunflower star is the world's largest sea star, growing to be up to 3.5 feet in diameter. Additionally, they're one of the fastest moving sea stars we know of. They grow to have more than 20 arms and are voracious predators. As predators, they're actually generalist predators, which means that they can eat a lot of different things. But some of their favorite foods are clams, urchins, mussels, snails. And you can actually see in this picture down here in the middle, this is a picture of a sunflower star eating an urchin. You can actually see a few purple spikes kind of popping out, which indicate that urchin being eaten down there. Speaking of eating, one of my favorite sea star fun facts is that sea stars actually eat by pushing their stomachs outside of their body, enveloping their prey in that extruded stomach, digesting the prey outside of their body, and then sucking the juices up. Pretty cool, right? So they're giant, they have 25 arms, predatory, and digest their food externally. So I can kind of understand why my parents thought this critter was a sea monster. Let's see. One second here. There we go. So on the next slide here, I have the range of the sunflower star outlined over here in this kind of pretty purple color. Historically, the sunflower star ranged from about Baja, California, all the way down to Mexico, all the way up along the west coast to the Aleutian Islands in Alaska. They tend to prefer shallow depths down to about 150 feet, but have also been found at depths exceeding 1,000 feet. Now, historically, across this entire range, they were pretty common and were a regular occurrence on dives across much of the region. So now that you've met the sunflower star, you might be thinking, why do we care about conserving a sea monster? So now let's talk about the sea star kelp forest connection. As voracious predators, sea stars can have a big impact on the food webs around them. Since the sunflower star preys on urchins, they can theoretically promote healthy kelp forests by keeping populations of kelp-munching urchins low. And there have been several studies that have borne this out. Several studies have found that when the sunflower sea star was removed from the kelp forest, there were more urchins. Those urchins were out and about on the reef, grazing on the kelp, and consequently, there was less kelp. So we know that they have the potential to impact the state and resilience of kelp forests, but we don't know how often they actually do this. Actually, there are a lot of things that we don't really understand about the role that the sunflower sea star has to play in kelp forests. For example, if there are other predators in the system, like otters, do sunflower stars influence urchin densities as much? If the urchins are starved the way that they are in barrens, urchin barrens, will the sunflower stars still eat them? If these stars have access to other kinds of prey, like mussels or clams, do they eat as many urchins? So I'm just trying to kind of illustrate that we need a lot more research, both in the lab and in the field, to better describe and predict when and where the sunflower star protects kelp forests. With that being said, one thing I want to point out is that in many places, sunflower stars are one of the only major urchin predators around. In North America, urchin-eating predators like otters and spiny lobster are often important to keeping kelp forests healthy. If you look at this map over here, I've laid out the ranges of the West Coast's major urchin predators. We've got the sunflower sea stars range in purple. We've got the otters range here in brown, sheep's head range in dark blue, and the range of spiny lobsters in red. Now, if you're familiar with any of these species, just note that they're all predators that can eat or scare away urchins and have been found to promote healthy kelp forests through their effects on urchins. Now, along the entire coast of the west coast of North America, kelp forests are present, going from Baja all the way up to the Arctic. So if you look at this map, you'll notice that there is a huge swath of the range of kelp forests on the west coast where sunflower stars are the only major predator left, or maybe one of only two. Where you don't have otters or sheep's head or lobster, historically, the sunflower star was one of the only predators left that can eat urchins in high enough quantities to reduce their densities and preserve kelp. So nowadays, there are many places along the west coast that with the disappearance of the sunflower sea star, there essentially aren't any major urchin predators left. And as you'll notice from this map over here, Oregon is one of those places. Okay, so those are some of the really cool things about our sea monster friend, the sunflower star. Now let's get to the not so cool part. Many of you at this point may have already heard of sea star wasting disease, which was a massive epidemic that broke out in 2013 and started killing sea stars. Over the course of the next couple of years, wasting disease struck essentially the entire West Coast, from Mexico to Alaska, affecting many sea star species and dramatically reducing their populations. Up here, you can see a picture of a wasting sunflower star on the top right. And you can see these lesions, these white lesions on its body, and how it kind of almost looks like it's decaying or decomposing. To give you an idea of how quickly this epidemic impacted stars in some locations, beneath on the bottom row here, we've got a rock in the Salish Sea shown 3 weeks apart. On the left, before the outbreak hit, this rock was completely covered in sunflower stars. And then on the right, just a few weeks later, they were all gone. And so this is an observation that many people up and down the coast were having as the epidemic progressed. Like 1 week, there were sunflower stars there, and next month, there just weren't. And so how bad was this crash for sunflower stars? Well, the team that I'm a part of, a team funded by the Nature Conservancy, undertook an IUCN Red List assessment. IUCN stands for the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, and they host something called the Red List, which is an international designation of whether a species is endangered or not. We collected data on when and where the sunflower star has been found from 33 data contributors, which added up to about 48,000 surveys all across the West Coast. We used this data to assess just how much their populations had been reduced across this range. We found that from Baja to Alaska, the population size of sunflower stars has declined by about 91% due to this epidemic. And we estimated that in total, about 5.7 billion sea stars died. And yes, that is billion with a B. Now, these frightening declines were bad enough that they pushed the sunflower star into the critically endangered category on the IUCN Red List, which is the most severe status a critter can receive other than extinct. So how bad was this crash? It was really, really, really bad. So I said that their populations declined by about 91%. So where are the remaining populations, that other 9%? Well, I can tell you that the species is essentially extinct in the lower 48 states in the US. We estimated their populations from Baja to about Cape Flattery, so the outer coast of Washington, have declined by on the order of 98 to 100%. And in fact, in a lot of these areas, the sunflower star really does appear to be essentially extinct. For instance, of the thousands of surveys we looked at, not a single sunflower star has been found in Mexico since 2015, in California since 2018, and I think only 3 have been found in Oregon, according to our survey, since 2015. However, as you begin to move north and you get into the Puget Sound, the Salish Sea, British Columbia, you start to find surviving populations again. Up north, we found that in the Puget Sound, British Columbia, and most of Alaska, their populations only declined by about 70 to 95%, less so than down south. Even up north, though, their remaining populations are really patchy. So for instance, in some places like Haida Gwaii off the coast of British Columbia, they've barely been seen since the outbreak. And then on the other hand, we have reports of divers in some of the fjords of British Columbia that have found 20, 30, 40 sunflower stars on a single dive. In fact, this picture over here to the left is a picture of 4 sunflower stars found on a dive in the fjords of central BC just this year. So that's really exciting news. There are still populations in the northern half of the range that appear to be pretty stable, albeit at very reduced densities. So in many places across this range, it's been 4 to 7 years since the outbreak began. And so that's the natural kind of next question is, have these populations began to recover at all? Well, based on the data that we collected, we would say no. We don't see any evidence for populations beginning to bounce back, even in those places that still have surviving populations. On the outer coast of the contiguous US, sunflower star populations have flatlined around 0. And in the more northern areas, they've either remained steady or have been very slowly decreasing in the past 2 or 3 years. So this is particularly concerning because other sea star species that were impacted by wasting have begun recovering their populations in some places. For example, here in Oregon, the charismatic intertidal ochre sea star was hammered by wasting syndrome, totally wiped out. But now I went out to Seal Rock a few weeks ago at low tide and I could see plenty of them crawling around. So while some other sea star species are recovering, the sunflower star is not. And right now, we don't know whether the sunflower star is going to come back in the lower 48 in coming years or not. So just to summarize their current status, we saw catastrophic losses globally, and by globally, I just mean throughout their entire global population. They're nearly extinct on the outer coast of the contiguous US. Remaining populations are found through Puget Sound, British Columbia, and Alaska. And thus far, we're not seeing their populations bounce back at all. So what can we do now? What are our conservation options for this marvelous little sea monster? Well, one thing I need to point out is that before we do any real conservation, we need to know more about the species and particularly about the disease. So it's been about 7 years since this epidemic began, and scientists still don't even know what actually causes this disease. I mean, think about that. This is one of the worst die-offs of marine animals in recorded history. Billions of animals died in a few years. And now, almost a decade later, we still don't even know what causes the disease. We need to be able to identify the pathogen, the virus, the bacteria, whatever it is that's causing this disease. We have to identify that before we can do a lot of serious conservation work. Why do we need this information? Well, think about if we spent people's time and money trying to reintroduce a bunch of sunflower stars back into Oregon or California, and then they just all died from the disease in the first 6 months. Our conservation options are really limited until we understand this disease. We understand the disease itself better. 1 second here, folks. Why is my... Okay. So yes, our conservation options are really limited until we understand this disease itself. So understanding that research is one of the first steps to conserving the species, what are some of our other options? Well, some of the options that our team came up with are 1, translocations, which would involve taking sea stars from surviving populations in the northern half of the range and reintroducing them down south. 2, we could introduce captive breeding programs instead, which would require finding surviving non-diseased stars, breeding them in captivity, and reintroducing those critters down south, kind of like what's been done with California condors. And then additionally, 3, it could be important to try to protect the remaining stars that are left up north, considering how low their populations are. For instance, sunflower stars often get caught in crab traps or on long line fishing lines. Right now, we don't really know whether that bycatch is hurting the remaining populations. We don't know if it kills them or not when they get caught in crab traps. So these are some of the options that we have right now. And I can tell you that the Nature Conservancy is currently supporting captive breeding efforts with the hope of having established captive animals should there ever be interest in reintroducing them. And additionally, I think I'm allowed to announce this, but the Nature Conservancy recently received some extra funding to fund one of the top marine epidemiologists to try to pin down what exactly it is that causes this disease, which is a real victory and super exciting work. So there are things going on. People are interested, trying to get momentum going, but we're still really at the very beginning of trying to conserve this species. If you're interested in what you can do, one thing that you can do is help us gather information about the surviving populations. And so if you ever see a sunflower star out in the wild, you can report it either at seastarwasting.org or on the website iNaturalist. And this is information that scientists use to keep track of where we do see remaining populations. And that tells us a lot about how the populations, if the populations are recovering, how they're doing, things like that. Additionally, you can also call your local representatives and tell them that you care about saving the sunflower star, because it really is politicians that control a lot of the purse strings for conservation efforts. So if we tell them that we care about this animal, it could translate into funding, into person power, into time and energy put towards doing this conservation work. So those are some of our options looking forward. Now I'd like to think a little bit about what this means for us here in Oregon. So a few things for us Oregonians to keep in mind are that we are unlikely to see the sunflower star back in Oregon anytime soon without human intervention. These are pretty long-lived, slow reproducing sea stars, and considering that their adult populations look to be essentially extinct in Oregon, we don't expect them to rebound anytime soon. At this point, we've lost our 2 most important urchin predators in Oregon, which otters, which were extirpated around in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and then the sunflower sea star. Related to the loss of urchin predators, we are starting to see increased urchin densities in many parts of the state, particularly down south, where we have some of our biggest, most beautiful kelp forests. And like you can kind of see in this picture over here to the right of an urchin barren in Cape Arago. I took that picture last summer. Another thing to note is that we are beginning to lose some of our kelp forests to these urchins, particularly down south in places like Port Orford and Coos Bay. We don't know what the extent of these losses are, but we are starting to see certain kelp forests that are regularly visited by sport divers and fishermen we are starting to see them slip away, and we think it has something to do with these increasing urchin densities and loss of top predators. So, if Oregons wanted to do something about protecting kelp forest ecosystems, one option would be to try to reintroduce a predator like otters or sunflower stars. Currently, there aren't any groups considering sea star reintroduction in Oregon, but if you're interested in learning more about otters, I would suggest checking out the Alaka Alliance, which is leading the charge to consider whether to reintroduce sea otters back into Oregon or not. I would also just like to note that as far as kelp forests go, loss of top predators and increased urchin densities, that's not the only thing challenging and threatening our kelp forests here in Oregon and along the West Coast. It's a complex issue, and there are a lot of other factors related to climate change and water pollution that may be negatively impacting kelp forests as well. And that's part of what I study for my PhD thesis. So it's not only the predators, but in some systems, these predators can play a really important role. And so in terms of looking at our options for preserving kelp forests in Oregon, predators like the sunflower star and otters may have a substantial role to play in that. So, nearing the end of my presentation here, we could all just take a step back for a second and look at what the case of the sunflower star shows us about conservation. My point number one that I think it shows us, yes, we all love big, beautiful, intelligent mammals. They can't be our definition of conservation anymore. As you can see through the relationship between sea stars and kelp forests, when we lose creepy crawly invertebrates or plants or algae, that reverberates through our tightly interconnected ecosystems and ends up affecting everyone. We have to move beyond charismatic megafauna to start thinking about all parts of our treasured ecosystems and how to preserve them, even the sea monsters. Point number two, expect more of this. Let's think about something here in terms of sea star wasting disease. Sea star wasting disease is not new. We've seen it before. It's popped up multiple times in California going back to the mid-1900s. So we've seen much smaller local scale disease outbreaks prior to this. So this is not a new disease. Something changed though. Something supercharged it. And in 2013, during one of the worst marine heat waves in the West Coast's history, it went from a small problem in California to coming close to wiping out an entire species distributed from Mexico to Alaska. We don't know if or exactly how this epidemic was related to climate change, but I can tell you that the scientific community has been telling us for years, as the climate changes, it begins to kick off cascading chains of events. And you start to see surprises. You start to see things changing really quickly. You start to see breakdowns in these systems. I don't want to dishearten anyone, but I just want folks to be aware that we're going to start seeing more events like this that happen very quickly and can challenge the integrity of entire ecosystems. So we all need to start thinking about how we want to respond to that information, what we want to do, knowing that, events that are as drastic as sea star wasting disease epidemic are likely going to continue to increase in frequency. And then point number three, I think something that I've learned throughout this process is I think the case of the sunflower sea star brings up some really good questions about how do we fund science and conservation in the face of a changing planet. It's been about 7 years since this epidemic broke out. This epidemic thought to be one of the biggest wild marine die-offs in history. It's been 7 years since billions of animals died across an entire continent, and we still don't even know what's caused this disease. And conservation efforts have really just now started due to the resolve of a few folks at the Nature Conservancy. State governments and local state and federal governments in Alaska, Washington, California, and Oregon really haven't responded at all to this. And so this kind of slow, awkward, reactionary response to intense ecological disasters, it's just not cutting it. And I hate to bring this up without having a good solution or a good way that I think that we can change it. But to be honest, I'm not sure how we change the structure of US funding and research to address this problem. I'm still relatively early in my career. I'm trying to figure it out too. But I do know that the current regime and the current way that we try to do conservation, it's not working that well. We need the help of lots of different kinds of people to figure out how we do it better. We need fishermen, coastal residents, artists, authors, scientists, politicians, all these different groups of people. We all need to start thinking creatively and thinking fast about how we navigate our changing relationship with nature. So that's about where I wrap up here, folks. Fortunately, I think we're going to have about 15 minutes for questions, which is always one of my favorite parts of giving a talk. But before we get to any questions, I want to thank you all so much for making time to come and share your attention with me and with this marvelous little sea monster. I'd also like to thank so many of the folks who were involved in making this work happen. As you can see over here on the left, some of the most important ones were my co-leaders in this effort, Sara, Deanna Sacamano, and Walter Hetty. I'd like to thank the Nature Conservancy for all the funding that they've provided and all the really forward-thinking conservation leadership they provide. I also just want to note that in terms of the IUCN assessment over here on the right, this is a list of all the people who helped us put that together. So that really is, it really has been an incredible team effort to get to be a part of. And then finally, I just want to make myself available to folks. Do you have questions? Do you have data you think you should share? Are you interested in learning more or maybe joining the Pycnopodia recovery team? My email is right here. It's hamiltsaw@oregonstate.edu. And additionally, it's really easy to find me on Twitter at SaraHamilton593. I'm always happy to talk with members of the community that are interested in this species. So please feel free to reach out. But I'll just leave it there and open it up for Cinnamon to help me take questions with the last, looks like 12, 13 minutes that we got here.
Thank you so much, Sara. And we do have questions that have been coming in throughout the talk. So I'm going to back up just a little bit and start with one of the first ones. Before sea star wasting, can you talk about what controlled the southern end of the species range? Do you know?
Ooh, that's a fabulous question. I like that one. Yeah. So one thing I want to note is that prior to sea star wasting, there certainly was research going on about sea stars. However, because a lot of people don't see them because they're deep down and they're in the ocean, because they're not harvested and because they're not particularly charismatic, there wasn't a lot of funding going towards researching sea stars. So you would be kind of amazed at how little we actually know about this species. But there has been some work showing that potentially temperature was controlling the southern end of their range distribution. So particularly down in Baja and Southern California, where the waters are much warmer, there's less nutrients in the waters. We did see lower population densities of sunflower stars down there prior to sea star wasting. So temperature likely has something to do with it, but we don't have a lot of research on other factors. So can't really rule other ones out. But that's a really great question and something my co-author team and I have been, let's just say, discussing heatedly in an upcoming academic paper we're writing.
Great, thank you. So can you talk a little bit about any guesses of why the sunflower sea star has been impacted more than other species of stars on our coast?
Oof, that's a really good question too. It's a little bit, there's a lot of theories around sea star wasting disease that are out and kind of flying around. And so some of the theories that I have heard is that there are soft-bodied and hard-bodied sea stars. And what do I mean by that? I mean by, if you think of, most of you probably haven't seen like a blood star, but blood stars are their body is just kind of hard. It's got a lot of kind of skeletal structures on the outside. It's not very fleshy. It's very compact as compared to things like Dermasterius or Pycnopodia that have much softer, fleshier kind of epidermis. So there's, since this seems to attack their skin or their epidermis and kind of eat them from the outside in, it's thought that maybe how hard or protected their epidermis is has something to do with how vulnerable they are to the disease. And so Pycnopodia, as one of those really fleshy soft stars, was hit hardest. Additionally, there's a hypothesis about it has something to do with sea star size. So basically, just the way surface area and volume interact. As sea stars get bigger, they have, let me see if I can remember this. They have a lower surface area of their epidermis to volume ratio. And I think the hypothesis was that had something to do with increasing the likelihood of oxygen depletion. So there's also a theory going around that oxygen depletion on the skin of sea stars has something to do with it. And so, but there's not any really good kind of smoking guns in regards to that, I would say. So those are the theories I've kind of heard secondhand about it.
So kind of going along those same lines, there's another question here. Can you expand what you're thinking about the impact of the marine heat wave with this event?
Yeah, that was a very contested topic in the scientific community, as I found out in this process. So what do we know about temperature and heat waves and this disease? Well, we know that sea star wasting kind of got kicked off before these heat waves really set in. So in 2013, when we first started seeing this epidemic kind of sweep through the coast, those marine heat waves had not quite started yet. And furthermore, a lot of the evidence looks like it's not that temperature kicks off the epidemic. It doesn't help precipitate it or start it or trigger it. However, what we're kind of seeing both in lab experiments, field experiments, and in just the patterns we see in the remaining populations, in places where the water is warmer, the disease impacts are worse. In lab experiments, the sea stars tend to die at higher rates, and they tend to die more quickly when the water is warmer. Additionally, when you scale that up to continental scale patterns, the fact that the disease hit them much harder in the southern half of their range, so where it's warmer from Washington to Baja, they're all gone. And where it's cooler further up north into British Columbia and Alaska, we still see surviving populations. So my personal theory is that sea stars don't have very good immune systems. And when they get stressed out in various ways, their immune capacity really tanks. And so my personal theory is that warmer waters and heat waves probably compromise their immune system, maybe made whatever it is that's whatever the pathogen is, a virus or a bacteria, they probably made that pathogen grow faster, and it probably made the population level impacts of the disease worse. However, temperature is one of the only ones we've looked at. We still haven't looked at how salinity or oxygen depletion or other things could impact the course of the disease. So temperature likely had something to do with it, but it probably wasn't just like temperature caused this whole thing. It's much more complex than that.
Sara, can you go a little bit more? You had talked about one potential option is captive breeding. Can you talk about the challenges and things that folks are thinking about along those lines, and why, just go a little deeper on why that we haven't started going down that route already?
Ooh, very good question. It turns out that sunflower stars hate to live in captivity. They pretty much, anytime you bring a sunflower star into an aquaria or a lab, it just dies. So for a long time, people weren't keeping them in aquariums and zoos and things like that. And so we don't have a very good understanding of why it is they're so sensitive to living in captivity, but also how to rear them successfully in captivity. And historically, since they're not really eaten, harvested or eaten or anything like that, there wasn't a lot of incentive to. So a few years ago, the Nature Conservancy started funding a program up in the Seattle area with a University of Washington researcher. And it's taken them a couple years to figure out how to do it right, but they've got a small captive breeding program going. And it's been really fun every couple of months to get pictures of the little tiny baby sea stars. At first it was just pictures of them under a microscope. They were so small. but now I think they're up to like a centimeter, a couple centimeters. Um, so it's that captive breeding, that investment has paid off, and we learned a lot about how do you keep them alive, and then not only how do you keep them alive in captivity, how do you get them to reproduce, and how do you get those little teeny tiny juveniles to grow? Surprisingly difficult. It turns out I could go on and on about how cool sea stars are, but so yes, that's the only captive breeding currently that I'm aware of. However, there is some interest in maybe, I know there's at least one or two scientists at OSU who are interested in trying to start one up at Hatfield, actually, a captive breeding program. And the idea would be to, as much as possible, try to source those initial adults from local populations. And then so that you're not taking sea stars from Alaska and trying to breed them and raise them for Oregon. Like they may not be well adapted for the conditions we have down there. So ideally, you'd want to try to find a couple adults, in Oregon or California, and try to breed them locally in a captive breeding program, and then do outplanting. Yeah, I think was that. Did I answer that question? I forgot if there were multiple parts to it.
No, I think you did. So there's a question or a kind of a comment that came in that 20 years ago we had a NOAA tank in the visitor center, and it caught rockfish when they were sleeping, and so they had to take it out.
No way, that's amazing. See, a literal sea monster, just like it's got 25 arms, it's creeping up on rockfish while they're alive, and just, that's amazing. Wow, I didn't know that. So yeah, thanks for that info.
Nice. So another question is, do we know if the sea star wasting impacts juveniles, larvae, or just adults?
Another really good question. Yeah, let me try to dig deep into the depth of my knowledge about them. I don't remember what the literature, like what lab experiments say about that. In general, juveniles of almost any species tend to be more sensitive to things. They don't quite have the same kind of, I don't know, they're not as strong. They don't have as fully developed systems to deal with external threats. So juveniles tend to be impacted more by almost anything. Additionally, one really concerning thing that we've heard from up in like British Columbia is they have seen spawning events or recruitment events. So they've seen tons of tiny little pycnopodia crawling around in the intertidal, and everyone's like, yes, they're coming back. They're recovering. And then like next spring, when they went back out to go survey again, they didn't see any. And it's kind of like, what happened? Where did they go? So where, yeah, that's just very concerning. My best guess is that I definitely believe that juveniles are impacted, and probably impacted just as bad, if not worse, than adults. And we do see some evidence that even new juvenile populations might be getting wiped out by wasting disease, unfortunately. So, but a lot of questions to be answered about that.
Sarah, in our last minute or so here, I had a couple of questions come in about, are you available to have to give your talks in other places, and how should people reach out to you? So I just wanted you to point out your contact information again.
Yeah, I love getting to talk with the public or talk with my communities is one of my favorite parts of this job. To be quite honest, academics are very stuffy people sometimes, and it's much more fun to get to talk with just my members of my community. So yes, I would love to come and give a talk. Again, my email right here is probably the easiest way to get in touch with me, and that's hamiltsaw at oregonstate.edu. Additionally, if for some reason you don't get that written down or anything, feel free to drop a note to Cinnamon, and she has my email and she can direct you towards me. So yeah, always available for that.
Absolutely. Thank you so very much. And as you can see, folks are saying thank you in the chat. So virtual claps for you, and thank you for sharing, and thank you for coming back and sharing. Sarah and I tried to do a similar talk a while ago, and we had some technical glitches, and so we were very excited to have another opportunity to share with this community the information that she was working on. So Sarah, I just want to thank you so much for being here. For everybody online, I just wanted to let you know that you get a little break from the main stage. We'll get started again at 12:15 with Bob Ziak. And until then, you have a few minutes to go wander around and explore the virtual Marine Science Day, and we hope to see you back in a few minutes. Thank you so very much. And Sarah, thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, awesome.
Right. All right.
Well, thank you so much, Cinnamon. Thanks for giving me this platform again to get to talk with people.